my grandfather was a businessman in Chicago and had 3 sons. Oldest name was Ralph, the second was Walter, and the third was my father, Robert. My grandfather's name was Elisha, and it's interesting, they came from a group of the Puritans, the Presbyterian Church, if you will, where they thought highly of our Judeo-Christian background and named their children with often with Jewish names. Elisha was my grandfather. He had an older brother who was one of the pioneer physicians in Chicago, and this last son of his, Robert, as a baby, born in January, but had suffered in the spring from asthma as a tiny baby, and Elisha's brother, I'll try to think of his first name in a minute, suggested that he get the baby up on the water up in Michigan, away from the weeds and so forth in Chicago. Okay. And they had some friends who were members of the Chicago Club who invited them to come. Those were the Quaker Oats people. That name escapes me. I'll maybe come back to it. And they came on a steamer that was a combination steam and sail and made 2 or 3 stops. And I would imagine it was a 2-day trip on steamer to get to Charlevoix, and spent that summer or the brief time they were there with the folks on the Chicago Club. And they found their baby was so well, and they liked it so much, and Elisha, my grandfather, enjoyed sailing. Although he'd been raised a farm boy, he was exposed to it in the Chicago area. And so they came back and stayed then at the Hallett Hotel, which was right next to where the Gray Gables is now. A young member of the Belvedere Club has just built a home on what was an empty lot that had been the Hallett Hotel.
Ah, okay. I know that. New home.
Yes. And while they were there that summer, which is 1884, they knew of this community from Kalamazoo that had just started a summer resort, trying to figure out what to do with land that had all been clear cut. And my grandfather Elisha went up and took out a 100-year lease on 2 lots that were right next to or across the street from their meeting hall, and it was kind of a religious community from Kalamazoo, but they weren't at all discriminatory, and the Wares were very religious, and were one of the reasons they took those lots where they could be right there, and they were on their knees, I'm sure, every time the doors were open. And so that's that building that was there. I found this interesting that nobody seemed to know, was moved, I don't know what year, but before I was born.
You're talking about the meeting hall building?
The meeting hall building was moved, put on rollers and rolled around, and became the barn. Wow. For the club equipment and hand tools and so forth. They just tore that barn down this winter.
Really?
I just noticed it wasn't gone, and I asked Mr. Conlon if he knew where that came from and what it had been, and he didn't. And I told him that had been their meeting hall before they had a hotel, which wasn't built till I think about 1895, and before they had a casino to hold meetings in.
So So that barn lasted over 100 years, didn't it?
Oh, yes, it was over 123 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Because it was there at the time. Elisha and his wife Mary Ann, who preferred to be called Minnie, it was a go-go name at the time, I guess. And so they raised their 3 boys here, and they sailed, and they all enjoyed sailing. But Elisha had a boatmaker make a boat for them. He didn't want his boys to drown, and he built a sailboat for them, and the boys derisively called it ivory soap because it would float, it wouldn't sink. The bar of soap. But most of his boats were named Frolic.
Oh my.
And it was interesting. I found an old postcard downtown one time and brought it home of a nice boat sailing under the bridge, and I put a magnifying glass on the stern of the boat. Frolic.
Oh my goodness, good for you.
Yes, yes. Yes, and in our cottage today, we still have some of the mission-type furniture that Mrs. Ware bought back in about 1890, I presume. And there's pictures of Mr. and Mrs. Ware in the cottage sailing in 1890s. They loved their time up here, and
pass that on to their family, their
it
children.
went on to their children. Elisha Ware died in 1910, and then the cottage was carried in the name of the Minnie A. Ware and Minnie A. Ware estate, and then became the 3 boys, and then Mrs. Walter Ware had ideas that she'd rather have another place, and so the Ralph and Robert bought out Walter Ware, and then Mrs. Ralph Ware decided they wanted to go to La Jolla in the summer because she was a California girl.
Okay.
So Robert Ware bought out Ralph Ware, and it became the Robert Ware Cottage.
Is there just one cottage now, or are there 2?
No, there's just one cottage, and I think we're the only family on the Belvedere Club that are the original family still in the original cottage.
Wow, that's a neat distinction.
Yeah.
A long time.
Dad used to tell stories of their going by horse and buggy over to Mount McSaba to have a picnic, and Chief McSabe would charge them 50 cents to come in because the Indians lived there and it was their home grounds. And also later, I guess in the 1920s, going out to Loeb Farms for ice cream.
Yeah, that was a favorite Sunday tradition.
It
for lots
was
of
a
people.
Sunday tradition. The other tradition that we came to know was the fountain at Fessenden's drugstore, where they made a confection called a Jeff that cost 25 cents and had to be hand-made, turned, and it was marvelous.
Yes, I think that tradition stopped in the late 70s, as I recall. Yes, they still made Jeffs when I was a girl.
Did they?
Yes.
Joanne Carey, who was, I think, the store manager for the people that took over after the Fessendens, Mrs. Don Carey, still recalled that it was a special chocolate that they bought from to make Jeffs. That's what made
them so good.
You know, one name that I think I don't find anywhere in Charlevoix history, but I think is very interesting, is the name Allie Moore. Allie Moore, don't know his background, but he was a an ice skater, a racer, high-speed ice skate racer. It's my idea that Ralph Ware, the oldest of the three boys, got him roller skating, and then they got him to promote. Their business was the Chicago Roller Skate Company.
Oh, really?
Ware Brothers Chicago Roller Skate Company.
Okay, that makes sense.
And they got him to use their skates and turn his talent to roller skating, and he won contests all over the world and entitled himself, or somebody, maybe Uncle Ralph titled him, the world's champion roller skater, and he used Chicago skates. He toured Europe and skated, as they said in those days, before all the crowned heads of Europe, and was a very interesting man. Later, and a native of Charlevoix. Later in his career, I would say in the 1920s, he and his wife had built an old-fashioned schooner, one of those that looked like the things that the Spanish came to the United States with, the high rear stern, and sailed it. It was called the Golden Rule.
Oh my goodness.
And the people in the Belvedere Club got Allie Moore to take their sons and teach them to sail on the Golden Rule. And I think that's how our tradition of gangs on the Belvedere Club got started.
Okay.
Because we now have I won't say they're play groups, but they're activity groups by ages and by sex. And they have very competent young college people and it's a very desirable thing that young people want to have their children do, because they learn to golf, tennis, all those kind of things, sail, go down the Jordan, go on overnights. And we have some very competent college-age young people. One time when my children were in gang, Dave and Betty Sim, S-I-M-E, were Dave at that time held the world's record in the 220 on a straightaway and had tied the world's record for the 100-yard dash and was a great Olympian. And more stories about David later, but that's in the athletic department.
So they had the concept of child care down at the Belvedere.
Pardon?
They had the concept of child care down very early.
Absolutely, yes. And you know, back to some of the points of our being discriminatory, we lived in a very discriminatory times, and Jewish people were discriminated against and were not. It's even cited in a journal that the Charlevoix Chamber of Commerce put out, and I could bring it to you if you wanted to read it, that membership in the Chicago clubs and the Belvedere Club are reserved for Gentiles only.
Do you remember the date of that? Is it in the 30s or 20s that was written?
Probably in the 20s.
In the 20s, okay.
And I have that pamphlet on, and I have it marked as an interesting point. Yet despite this, one of the things that my father would never miss any year at church was when they invited Rabbi Mann from Chicago to preach. And they just thought so highly of him. And actually, as we think about theology today, I think most of our old Presbyterians, Baptists, whatnot, were better good Jews than they were Christians in terms of love thy neighbor. They thought of the 10 Commandments, but you know, our Lord said there are only 2 commandments. The first is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, and with all thyself. The second is like unto it. Thou should love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. that was, of course, the new doing away with the old law, rules of law. This was the new covenant that Christ brought. But as I say, I think they were hung up more on the Old Testament than they were the New, and I didn't realize.
That's interesting. Perhaps it was someone in the chamber who decided that should be, rather than the people of the community themselves.
Oh, I think it was obviously somebody in the chamber, the people in the community. You know, the people that lived on the Belvedere Club, because they're kind of self-supporting over there with all they do. As we grew up, we didn't know anyone really in town except the doctor, and thought of the people in the town of Charlevoix as the groundsmen that worked on the club.
Sure.
And because those were the only folks we knew.
And the shopkeepers where you traded.
The shopkeepers where we traded. I notice there's a young man in business now who has the same name as a boy who was a dear friend of my father's when they were little boys growing up.
Okay.
And he's a contractor, has a place on May Street now.
Can't help
you can't help me.
I'm too,
It's a French name.
LeBlanc?
No.
No.
No. I remember going over to Cook's, the gambling place, with my parents because they served wonderful meals and very inexpensively, or else my father wouldn't have been there.
I see. So he wasn't a gambler then?
He was not a gambler, but he acknowledged that upstairs there were games of chance that went on. We didn't know about that. Occasionally we went to the hotel for Sunday dinner, and that was always an experience because you were always up on your feet as people came by to visit with your parents.
As a youngster, you had to stand.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what do you remember about Petoskey Shooting Gallery?
Oh, yes, we loved to go to Petoskey, and of course all the women loved to go to Petoskey to shop. But the reason we boys went to Petoskey was they had a magnificent shooting gallery. And my brother Bob in particular was very good, and I can just still hear the lead plink on those ducks, and they would go over. And you know, that's what we loved about Petoskey. That's all we really, as little people, we knew. I do remember when they built the veterinary hospital that's on this side of Petoskey.
Jensen's.
Jensen's.
Yes.
It must have been in about 1938 or 39.
Wow.
My cousin Peggy and I drove by it. Peggy could drive then. She and I went to see a movie that I still remember as one of the best I've ever seen, called Lost Horizon, with Ronald Coleman. And that was the place in Lost Horizon that was so interesting. It was called Shangri-La.
Okay, I wondered. I was there had that connection.
Yeah.
That's neat. Did you come up by car when you were a boy from Chicago?
Yes, we came up by car, although I recall at least one time coming on the Manitou when we had a stateroom.
Okay. What was that like?
Well, that was very interesting. It was like an ocean voyage. And I've never been on an ocean. Well, I have now, but I had never been. But you had a stateroom and looked over the rail, saw the water going by, and it was...
Do you remember anything about the roughness of the trip?
No, don't remember a thing about that.
Okay, well, that probably was nice.
I do remember that the big ships that used to come in, the North and South America, were tourist ships that toured the Great Lakes and came in. I remember in wartime when an aircraft carrier came and anchored and stood right off of our pier.
Wow.
And boy, you looked at it and you know they're many stories high. And with the planes on it. And I thought, and it was kind of a foggy morning, and boy, you were glad that that was a friendly ship. And in later years, when I moved to Texas, I had friends, Marine fighter pilots, who told me they qualified for aircraft landings off that.
On that ship off Charlevoix?
On that ship that sailed on Lake Michigan.
Oh, neat.
There again, I can't think of the name of it now.
Well, I was wondering why the ship would have been on the lakes, but that makes good sense. It was a training.
It was to train for, and there were two of them.
Okay.
And they worked out of Great Lakes, and that's where naval air cadets qualified for carrier landings.
Okay.
And it was an ominous thing to see.
I'll bet. Well, you have a note here about Dr. Boucher's tale of the Carey boys.
Oh, Dr. Boucher. Dr. Boucher was a former president of the Belvedere Club. He was an academician, had been president of West Virginia University, chancellor or president at the University of Nebraska, a dean of the arts and science faculty at the University of Chicago, and then in his retirement years, president of Knox College in Galesburg.
Wow.
And it was a great golfer and an academic among most of these business people. Never had great income, had the smallest cottage, and they were folks that were just highly thought of. Just wonderful, wonderful people. But he would recall that when his house, his little house was number 135, when it needed painting, he would call Mr. Carey, and soon here would come these 6 big, handsome Carey boys with ladders and buckets and laughing and teasing each other, and go to work and paint that house. And just what a wonderful family they were.
Yeah.
I remember Marge Carey Coleman saying she was 15 years old before she had a room of her own. She was the only girl with 6 boys.
Oh, geez.
She's a wonderful lady.
Yeah.
Her husband talked to me one summer. I don't know where he had heard this, but I was a diver, springboard diver,
Okay.
in college. I also ran low hurdles and track, but that wasn't what he was interested in. He'd heard from my father that I had just won the Central Association of the AAU's 3-meter diving championship in Chicago, and came to me and asked, what's his name? Coleman. He was a well-known coach cross country, and Irish Coleman was what he was called, and he was doing the kind of public relations work, I think that's what Dad said to me, for the Chamber of Commerce. And he came and asked if I would dive exhibition for Venetian night while the boats were getting ready to parade. Well, I knew about Venetian night a little bit because when I was a very small boy, I think our boat was in one of the very first Venetian nights. I remember pulling up Japanese lanterns with candles